Hi, welcome to faithtalks.com. I'm your host, Mercy Hope. Today we're going to talk with Gary Wilkerson and hear his story, and he's going to talk about the legacy of his father. So this is just an exciting interview for me. So Gary, first of all, I'd just love for you to share. Obviously, you came from a wonderful Christian home and a wonderful heritage, but we all have our own stories and how faith becomes real in our life. So will you just share about that?
Yeah, I did grow up in a Christian home. Both my mom and dad come from Christian backgrounds themselves. My aunt, who studied sort of our family history, tells me that I'm like the 6th generation pastor or evangelist in our family. So my father, and then his father was a denominational leader with the Assemblies of God Church in Pennsylvania years ago. His father was a tent revivalist, kind of a fun old guy. I'd never had a chance to meet him. He died before I was born, but heard these amazing stories about his ministry. Like, as a quick example, he to get the attention of the crowd in these tent revivals he held, if he started losing their attention, he would start preaching on hell, and he had these little tiny paper filled with gunpowder behind him, and he'd start stepping on them, and sparks and smoke would fly out of the air. So he was quite a character. I never got the chance to meet him. And then his father, before him, was a pastor as well. And there are some rumors, I don't know if it's been substantiated, but we think that maybe my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a chaplain during the Civil War. So definitely, I mean, you sort of just were, the DNA is pretty strong when it comes to ministry in our family, and a lot of my uncles and cousins are in the ministry. Right now, one of my second cousins just married, did the wedding for Kanye West and Kim Kardashian. So there's really just all over the world. There's just these Wilkersons that are out there in ministry. And so I was hooked at an early age. At 6 years old, I knew I wasn't going to be a fireman, a policeman, anything else. I knew I was going to be a preacher. And so and it was strange. I don't know how to explain it now. At 6, how do you understand exactly what God's doing in your life? But I knew at 6 years old that I was called to be, to give my life to Jesus and to serve Him. And so growing up in that home, I never got into things. I never skipped school or drank or smoked or had any kind of quote unquote worldliness into my life that way. I did go through a season of doubt. It was like an intellectual thing, like how do I know this isn't just something my parents have kind of forced on me? Like, if I was born in India, would I be a Hindu? Maybe I'm just a Christian because I was born into this. So I went through an intellectual pursuit, almost lost my faith as an older teenager, just kind of thinking that maybe God's not real, or if He is, maybe He expresses Himself in all different kinds of ways. Almost landed in a faith called Baha'i, which is all roads lead to God. And I thought, well, that's a nice way of looking at this. But then, so in my older teenage years, this thing in my mind just came, this word from the Lord. I realized what it was. I am the way, the truth, and life, and no man comes to God except through me. And I said, okay, so it's either Jesus, or I have to write Him off the list of all these gods that could lead to holiness. And so I did. I said, it's Jesus. And sealed. And it was interesting because my dad, being in the ministry and being somewhat well known for his ministry, it was now I look back on that, it was a great joy to see that he was very patient during that time and didn't sort of condemn me or say, how dare you think that thought. He would let me talk and ask questions with them, and he said, I think he actually encouraged, like, you're going on a great exploration right now. I think the outcome is going to be really good. He was hopeful. He was like, yeah, go through that, because the outcome is going to make you stronger in your faith. And now looking back on that, I think it's amazing. And I've done that now I have 4 kids. I've done that with my kids as well. So just, I got into ministry young. I preached my first sermon when I was 16 and started my first church. My wife and I moved to the inner city of Detroit and founded a church right among the poorest of the poor and the gangs and the drugs, and raised up a great little church in the heart of the city there, and I've been in ministry ever since.
Awesome. Now, for anyone that's watching right now that is not familiar with the name Wilkerson, that's a sad thing. But obviously, for a lot of people, they're going to recognize the cross and the switchblade, either the movie or the book or the story, or Times Square Church. But for someone who's not familiar with that, can you just kind of give an overview of who was your father, and what was that ministry. What did that look
Yes,
like?
certainly. Yeah, Mercy, we were talking just before the interview started, and I was a little surprised you knew of the ministry because most people your age don't. Honestly, it's like 40s on, because a lot of his work was earlier in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
So I was blessed to hear that somebody as young as you knows about his ministry and our ministry. So he was a pastor of a small town church in Pennsylvania, and read an article about these gang members that had killed a little boy in the city, and just got in his car and went to see if he could help, and that opened up the doors to him working literally with hundreds of gang members and drug addicts. Out of that was born the movie and the book Cross and Switchblade, and the Teen Challenge centers, which are now 50 years later are in about 100 different countries, 1,400 different centers, working with thousands and thousands of young adults every year, setting them free from addictions. So it's a worldwide ministry. World Challenge was born out of that. So he's had an impact on literally probably hundreds of thousands of lives. And the reason I wrote the book about my dad's life was I kept hearing stories of people that very, very rarely would somebody say, I read the book, I liked it, or I heard a Teen Challenge, I think that's great. Oftentimes people come up to me almost like with a tear in their eye saying, I was changed by your dad's life. I read the book and I became a social worker, or I became a pastor, or I became a missionary. I read the book and I got saved, or I read it and gave it to my son who was a drug addict, he got saved, or like even here this week I met a number of people that said, I went through Teen Challenge and now I'm a publisher, and now I'm an author. So he's had a huge impact on a lot of people, and I hope my life has done that as well. I hope my son, now who's getting into the ministry, a young man, I hope he has that same kind of impact. And that's one of the things that these are names: Cross and Switchblade, Teen Challenge, World Challenge. Those are names and organizations, but the heart behind that, all of those things, why they are successful as they are, why they are what they are, is because of his faith. He was a man of faith. He really believed God, that God could do anything. He could do the impossible. And as a matter of fact, my dad was the kind of guy, like, if he would read an article that, like, where a secular environment would say it's impossible to do this, he'd go, let's go there, let's do that, because I want to. So, and it wasn't just because of that particular cause. It was so it wasn't like he was trying to solve the problem of drug addiction. It was like, the world says drug addicts can't be cured. Let's show God's power. Let's show His authority. And so his vision really was not just helping drug addicts or helping gang members. It was to glorify and honor the name of God. And he got that from an old book he had read, a guy named George Mueller. I don't know if you're familiar with that, the guy who started orphanages in England.
Yes.
And Mueller did that. He said, I love the orphans, but I really want to show that without asking for a dollar, without begging anybody, just through prayer and faith, that these lives can be changed and we could sustain orphan care all throughout England. And it was a faith-based ministry. So when my dad started both World Challenge and Teen Challenge, he started saying, let's prove that God is faithful. He's nothing's too hard for the Lord.
Amen. And
that's the vision I've carried on into my ministry today, and I continue as a pastor, and as I give leadership to World Challenge, I just believe that we look for the hardest parts, the most difficult places in the world, and that's where we engage in ministry.
Wow. So tell me a little bit about your church that you're currently pastoring,
So I was pastoring in another city, and a struggling church. I was discouraged. I was depressed. I didn't seem to be, had such a desire to see God do great things, and it seemed like the heavens were brass and the doors were closed. And I started traveling with Dad. He invited me to do these pastors' conferences, and this is when he was by now in his 70s. And as we were traveling together, he just started instilling once again this message that I remember when I was a kid: faith, believe God, trust Him. And so out of that, we birthed a new church. It started less than 5 years ago, and it has just exploded. I mean, thousands of people getting saved every Sunday. Altars are packed with people. It's in a nice kind of suburban middle-class neighborhood, and yet for some reason the Holy Spirit has drawn people from all over the city, black and white and rich and poor, gang members, drug addicts, along with CEOs, corporate executives, people from all walks of life, and just seeing amazing things. We've had a young man who was studying to become a mullah in the Muslim faith. He got saved and baptized, and now he's bringing scores of kids that he's reached out to in our neighborhood. to know Jesus. So I'm glad to see, I think some of that faith is oftentimes more caught than it is taught. And I think I kind of began to catch, I was taught faith at an early age, but sort of really caught onto it. And now, both in my church and in World Challenge Ministries, we're seeing growth, expansion of the ministries because of just really, again, believing God can do the impossible.
Absolutely. So what would you say to people who are watching right now, and maybe someone's really catching a vision for just hearing about your dad's faith and your faith and this generational thing, and maybe that's not their background,
Right.
maybe this is all sounding new to them, but
Yeah.
maybe there's something stirring in their spirit where they're like, man, I would like to step out in faith and do something for God or touch people's lives in that way. How can people get in touch with World Challenge or the ministries that you're doing, but also what would you just say to someone who is at that point of needing to encouragement to step out in faith?
Yeah, well, to get a hold of us, it's pretty simple. We have a website called worldchallenge.org, and on there we have my sermons, some of my father's sermons, some of the things that he's written online, but also talks about our World Challenge Missions Organization and ways you can get involved and help and just pray, and also even go to some of the places we're working around the world. So that's worldchallenge.org. What I would say to the first part of your question there, people that were wondering, well, it sounds good that guy was bold, or he had something in his heart, or you, Gary, you have that kind of faith that you learned. But what about me? I'm in this city, or I'm in this town, or I live in this village. How can I make a difference in the world? Because I think everybody really wants to live a meaningful life, have purpose, to know that their life was well lived. And I definitely would encourage you just to get involved right where you are. I think many people think that they have to go to the four corners of the world. They have to get on a plane and go somewhere, and that's absolutely not true. There is not a community. It could be the smallest farming village in North America, and you'll find a teenage kid who's depressed or suicidal.
Absolutely.
You can go into suburban areas and find kids. The suburban area I live in, I talked to a policeman a couple days ago, and he told me there are well over 1,000 kids in the two high schools in my neighborhood that are heroin addicts. And this is like an affluent, white middle-class neighborhood, and 1,000 heroin addicts. And so I have work to do right in my own, well-to-do neighborhood. And I think a lot of people, whether you're in the inner city, an urban area, or whether you live in a nicer suburb, or if you live in a farming community, there is a place for you to get involved. A lot of times I think it's great to ask your pastor, are there things our church is doing to get involved in helping the poor, whether it's overseas, do we have a feeding program? A lot of youth groups that work with us at World Challenge are raising funds for one of our ministries. Is called Please Pass the Bread, and it's a simple way, and so a lot of youth groups are adopting one feeding program overseas. So in Uganda, northern Uganda, a district called Lira is where the Lord's Resistance Army came in, a guy named Joseph Corney, and captured children and forced them into child warfare. And so these kids now have been freed, and they're coming back to their villages. Their moms and dad have been killed because of the war, the civil war in that area. And so we have these orphanages and feeding programs, and youth groups are kind of adopting those and saying we're having different fundraising events. Instead of spending all the money on Nintendo or Wii or Xbox, we're going to actually use some of our funds to help these children get reacclimated to life and get put into families. So there's all kinds of ways. But again, the centerpiece is to believe that you can. If you don't think you can do anything, you won't do anything. And my dad taught me, one of the phrases that we use at World Challenge is, we can't do everything, but we can do something. We can't affect the whole world, but there's something that each of us choose to do one thing. You choose to be a prayer warrior on behalf of the poor, the needy. If you choose to go on one missions trip in your life, or once a year, whatever you would choose to do, you choose to give financially to help different ministries, not just ours, but any of the good ministries that are out there, to get involved with your local church, and within your local church, ask if there's a way your pastors and leaders can help you form something, if there's not already a local outreach in your city. So we have one at our church. We started a few years ago, and believe it or not, our city, the Department of Human Services, was so touched by what we were doing. It was a thing at Christmas called Feed the Children, that they got involved, and they said, can we send all our clients to you at our church, an event there. About 11,000 people come every Christmas.
Wow.
And we have bouncy castles and food and clowns, and the costume guys from VeggieTales come, and we start telling people about Jesus, and our city is telling us, like, we want to send you more people, and you tell them about Jesus, and you help them, and miracles are happening, and so that's just one little church that just says we're gonna believe God to do something different in our city.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing your story and this story of legacy. And I hope that people will get this book. And like you said, for my generation, that this is a testimony that needs not to be lost, for sure. And also just thank you for taking the time, because faith comes by hearing.
Yeah.
And so I hope that for our viewers, that your hearts were really stirred and moved, and just encourage you absolutely that you can do something, and that your life can have meaning through Jesus Christ. So thank you for joining us today, and we just appreciate your time so much,
Enjoyed it.
and the blessing of your testimony.
Thank you, Mercy. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you.